What if I told you that the funeral of a sitting president once turned into a national security nightmare? That another president's body sat unrefrigerated for days while the country argued over what to do with him? That one funeral procession may have accidentally started a rumor that haunts Washington to this day? You probably think funerals are simple: somber music, a flag-draped casket, a solemn speech, maybe a horse-drawn carriage. But the deaths and burials of America's presidents are packed with strange rituals, bizarre coincidences, and stories your history teacher either didn't know or conveniently skipped. These aren't wild conspiracy theories. These are documented events, historical records, and first-hand accounts that somehow never made it into the textbook chapter about great leaders and their legacies. So before we start, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because stories like this don't get pushed by the algorithm nearly as much as they should, and I need your help getting these forgotten details in front of more people. Now get comfortable, because we're about to walk through 50 facts about presidential funerals that range from eerie to outright unbelievable. Some will make you laugh, some will genuinely creep you out, and a few might make you question just how much of American history gets sanitized before it reaches a classroom. Let's start at the very beginning, with the first president to ever be buried under the weight of a young nation's grief. Number 1. George Washington's death in 1799 sparked a debate so intense it delayed his burial for days. Doctors performed what could only be described as brutal, borderline medieval treatments in a desperate attempt to save him, including bloodletting so severe that historians now believe it likely hastened his death rather than prevented it. And once he passed, his family faced a bizarre standoff over where his body should actually rest, a disagreement so contentious that Congress itself got involved, all while rumors swirled that Washington had given quiet instructions to ensure he wasn't buried alive, a fear so common in that era that it shaped funeral customs for decades to come. Number 2. George Washington's lead-lined coffin. After all that debate about where Washington's body should rest, someone still had to actually build the thing he'd be buried in. Washington's remains were placed inside a heavy mahogany coffin, and inside that coffin was a lid lining designed to slow decomposition and protect the body from moisture. This wasn't just colonial extravagance. Lead linings were considered the gold standard for preserving remains in the era before embalming became common practice. The idea was that a sealed lead interior would keep air and water out, theoretically preserving Washington's body for future generations to view or study. Mount Vernon's original tomb was damp and poorly constructed, which made preservation even more of a priority for the family. Some historians believe the lead lining was also meant to prevent grave robbers from easily breaking into the coffin, since lead is notoriously difficult to cut through without proper tools. Whether that was the primary intention or simply a side benefit is something historians still debate, since written records from the era don't spell out every motivation behind the burial choices. What we do know is that the coffin was heavy. Multiple accounts describe pallbearers straining under the weight during the procession from the mansion to the tomb. Some estimates suggest the combined weight of the wood, lead, and remains made it one of the heaviest presidential coffins in American history, a detail that never quite makes it into the textbook version of Washington's death. The lead lining also created a strange side effect. Because Washington's coffin was so well sealed, later generations became convinced that his body might still be remarkably preserved, fueling curiosity, and as we're about to see, actual attempts to get inside. And speaking of people trying to get inside that coffin, let's talk about the time someone almost succeeded. Number 3. The failed theft of Washington's skull. In 1830, decades after Washington's death, a disgruntled former Mount Vernon employee attempted something almost too strange to believe. He broke into the burial vault with the alleged intention of stealing Washington's skull, reportedly to sell it or use it to extort money from the Washington family. The attempt failed, but it succeeded in absolutely terrifying everyone involved. Historical accounts suggest the intruder grabbed the wrong skull entirely, mistakenly taking the remains of a Washington family relative instead of the first president himself. Some versions of the story claim the thief panicked once he realized his mistake and abandoned the theft altogether, leaving the disturbed vault as evidence that something had gone horribly wrong. Whether every detail of this story is accurate is difficult to confirm, since first-hand documentation from the period is sparse and often relies on second-hand retellings passed down through Mount Vernon's caretakers. Still, the incident was taken seriously enough that it triggered immediate changes. The Washington family and Mount Vernon's overseers realized that the original tomb was far too vulnerable, a simple brick structure that any determined person with a crowbar could break into. This attempted theft became one of the key catalysts pushing Congress and the Washington family toward building a new, far more secure tomb, one with thicker walls, a heavier gate, and additional protective measures to prevent future break-ins. It's a strange twist of American history that the final resting place we know today, the one tourists visit at Mount Vernon expecting solemn reverence, exists partly because someone once tried to steal George Washington's head. And it raises an uncomfortable question about how many other presidential burial sites faced similar threats that simply never made it into official records. Speaking of burial sites that changed over time, not every founding father ended up exactly where he was originally laid to rest, and our next president is a perfect example of that. Number 3. John Adams's simple Quincy burial. Unlike Washington's elaborate lead-lined coffin and heavily guarded tomb, John Adams's initial burial was remarkably modest. When Adams passed away in 1826, on the exact same day as Thomas Jefferson, no less, he was placed in a simple family tomb in Quincy, Massachusetts, a far cry from the national mourning and elaborate security concerns surrounding Washington's remains. Adams had specifically wanted a quiet, unpretentious burial, reflecting the values of frugality and simplicity he championed throughout his political career. For years, his remains rested in this modest family vault alongside other Adams relatives, largely unnoticed by the broader public beyond Quincy. It wasn't until decades later that his remains, along with those of his wife Abigail, were moved to the United First Parish Church, sometimes nicknamed the Church of the Presidents, a location that also eventually became the resting place for his son, President John Quincy Adams, and his wife as well. This makes the church one of the only sites in the country where two presidents and their spouses share the same building for eternity. The move to the church wasn't purely sentimental. Concerns about the security and preservation of the original family tomb played a role, echoing the same worries that had prompted Washington's family to build a more secure resting place decades earlier. Some historical accounts suggest the original vault had fallen into disrepair, making the transfer somewhat necessary rather than purely ceremonial. It's worth noting that this relocation wasn't as dramatic or scandal-ridden as the attempted theft at Mount Vernon, but it does highlight an interesting pattern among early presidents. Even the most modest, unassuming burial plans often needed adjustments over time, whether due to security concerns, family requests, or simple structural decay. Adams may have wanted a quiet, humble burial, but even the quiet ones eventually became part of the strange, evolving story of how America handles its presidential remains. Number 4. Thomas Jefferson's self-written epitaph. If John Adams wanted a quiet burial, Thomas Jefferson wanted something even stranger. He wanted control over his own legacy, and he made sure of it by writing his epitaph himself years before he died. Jefferson left detailed instructions for his gravestone at Monticello, specifying the exact wording he wanted carved into the stone. And here's the part that surprises people. Nowhere on that stone does it mention that he was President of the United States. Instead, Jefferson chose to be remembered for 3 specific accomplishments: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. That's it. No mention of serving as the 3rd president, no mention of being Secretary of State or Vice President, nothing about the Louisiana Purchase, one of the largest land acquisitions in American history. Jefferson apparently believed those 3 achievements represented what he wanted history to remember: ideas and institutions rather than political titles. Some historians suggest this reflects Jefferson's genuine belief that ideas outlast offices, that a title granted by voters or the Electoral College meant less to him than intellectual and philosophical contributions meant to last centuries. Other historians argue it was a calculated piece of image crafting, Jefferson curating his own legacy the same way he curated almost everything else in his life, from his home to his library to his correspondence. Both interpretations are plausible, and honestly, we may never know exactly which one Jefferson intended, since he left no explanation beyond the instructions themselves. What we do know is that the original monument at Monticello deteriorated over time, partly due to weather and partly because visitors kept chipping off small pieces as souvenirs. a bizarre form of historical vandalism that plagued early presidential memorials more often than people realize. The obelisk was eventually replaced with a sturdier version, though the inscription remained faithful to Jefferson's original wishes. It's a strange thing to consider, a man who held the nation's highest office deliberately leaving that fact off his own grave. And it says something about how differently early presidents thought about legacy compared to how we think about it today. And speaking of presidents whose final resting places reflected complicated legacies rather than triumphant ones, let's talk about James Madison. Number 5. James Madison's unfinished tomb. James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, the fourth president, and one of the most influential political thinkers in American history, ended up with a burial situation that reflected something far less glamorous: financial hardship. When Madison died in 1836 at his Montpelier estate in Virginia, he was buried in the family cemetery there, and the marker placed over his grave was notably simple, especially considering his historical significance. Part of this modesty traces back to the Madison family's financial struggles in the years following his death. Madison's stepson, Payne Todd, had accumulated significant gambling debts, and Dolly Madison, James's widow, spent years fighting to keep Montpelier financially afloat. The estate was eventually sold off entirely, passing through multiple owners over the following decades. With the family's finances in such disarray, elaborate memorialization simply wasn't a priority, and for years Madison's grave remained modest compared to monuments built for other founding fathers. It wasn't until 1857, more than 2 decades after his death, that a taller obelisk was finally erected over his grave, funded partly through public efforts rather than family wealth. Even then, the monument was relatively plain compared to the grand tombs and memorials associated with contemporaries like Washington or Jefferson. Some historians see this as fitting, given Madison's famously modest personal demeanor, while others view it as an unfortunate historical oversight. A founding father whose contributions to the Constitution arguably shaped the entire framework of American government, resting for years under a marker that gave little indication of his significance. Montpelier itself changed hands repeatedly before eventually being restored in the 20th century, and today the estate operates as a museum reflecting on both Madison's political legacy and the complicated family history that followed his death. It's a reminder that even the most historically significant figures aren't immune to financial misfortune reaching beyond the grave. And speaking of presidential tombs that eventually received far grander treatment than their original burials, let's head to Richmond, Virginia for the story of James Monroe. Number 6. James Monroe's Gothic Revival Tomb. James Monroe's burial situation took its own unusual path. When Monroe died in 1831, he was initially buried in New York City, where he'd been living during his final years. It wasn't until 1858, nearly 3 decades later, that Virginia officials arranged to have his remains relocated to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, timed to coincide with the centennial anniversary of his birth. This relocation wasn't just a simple reburial. Virginia commissioned an elaborate cast-iron Gothic Revival structure to house Monroe's remains, a striking departure from the classical and neoclassical styles used for earlier presidents like Washington and Jefferson. The structure, sometimes referred to locally as the President's Tomb or occasionally nicknamed the Birdcage due to its intricate ironwork, features soaring Gothic arches and detailed metalwork that make it visually distinct from virtually every other presidential resting place in the country. Some historians believe the choice of Gothic Revival design reflected changing American architectural tastes in the mid-19th century, while others suggest Virginia wanted Monroe's tomb to stand out dramatically, reinforcing his legacy as one of the last founding generation presidents. The relocation itself sparked some debate at the time, with New York reportedly reluctant to give up Monroe's remains, given his decades of residence there. Virginia ultimately won out, framing the reburial as a matter of reclaiming a native son. Today, Monroe's Gothic tomb remains one of the more visually striking presidential memorials in the country, drawing visitors specifically because it looks so different from the simple obelisks and modest markers associated with earlier presidents. It stands as a reminder that presidential burial customs weren't fixed or consistent in early American history. They evolved constantly, shaped by politics, finances, regional pride, and shifting architectural fashion. And speaking of resting places that stirred up unexpected controversy long after burial, our next story involves a president whose death sparked one of the strangest medical mysteries in the nation's history. Number 7. John Quincy Adams's capital stroke. John Quincy Adams's death is one of the more dramatic stories in presidential history, mostly because of where it happened. Unlike his father, who died quietly at home, and unlike so many of his predecessors who passed away on their own estates, surrounded by family, Adams collapsed in the middle of doing his job. After his presidency ended, Adams did something almost no other former president has done. He returned to Washington and served in the House of Representatives, representing Massachusetts for nearly 2 decades. He apparently saw this second act not as a demotion, but as a continuation of public service, and he took it seriously right up until the very end. On February 21, 1848, Adams was sitting at his desk in the House chamber when he suffered a massive stroke. Colleagues reportedly saw him slump forward, and the chamber erupted into chaos as members rushed to help him. He was carried out of the chamber, and since moving him further seemed risky, he was brought to a nearby room within the Capitol itself, the office of the Speaker of the House. Adams never fully regained consciousness, and 2 days later, on February 23rd, he died right there inside the Capitol building. Some historians find this oddly fitting. A man so devoted to government and public service essentially dying at his post, rather than at home. Others point out the almost eerie symbolism of a former president collapsing in the very heart of the legislative branch, a branch he'd spent his post-presidential years fighting for causes like the right to petition against slavery. The room where he died became something of an informal historical landmark within the Capitol, sometimes referred to by staff and historians as the spot where Old Man Eloquent, Adams's nickname, took his final breath. Adams was given a funeral in Washington before his body was eventually transported back to Massachusetts for burial, a lengthy and formal process that reflected his stature as both a former president and a sitting congressman. It's a story that reminds us these men weren't just distant historical figures. They were working politicians, sometimes literally until their final moments. And speaking of presidents whose final resting places tell us something about their personal lives rather than their political ones, let's head down to Tennessee for Andrew Jackson. Number 8. Andrew Jackson's Hermitage Tomb. Andrew Jackson was a man defined by fierce loyalty, explosive temper, and deep personal devotion, especially when it came to his wife, Rachel. That devotion shaped his final resting place just as much as any political consideration did. When Jackson died in 1845 at his beloved estate, the Hermitage, just outside Nashville, Tennessee, he was buried in a spot he had personally chosen years earlier, right beside Rachel, who had died shortly before he took office as president back in 1828. Jackson reportedly blamed harsh political attacks during that campaign for contributing to Rachel's death, and by some accounts he never fully forgave the political establishment for what he saw as her mistreatment. Burying himself beside her wasn't just sentimental. Some historians argue it was almost a final political statement, Jackson choosing personal loyalty over public spectacle. The tomb itself sits within a garden at the Hermitage, beneath a domed monument supported by simple stone columns, understated compared to some of the grander memorials built for other founding-era presidents, but deeply personal in its design. Visitors today can still walk through that same garden and see the modest domed structure standing quietly among the trees, a stark contrast to the fiery combative image Jackson cultivated during his political life. Some historians suggest this contrast is exactly the point, that the private Jackson buried beside his wife was fundamentally different from the public Jackson who fought duels and dominated Washington politics through sheer force of will. Others caution against reading too much sentimentality into it, noting that wealthy landowners of the era often built family burial plots on their own estates as a matter of practicality and status. Either interpretation is reasonable, and the truth likely involves elements of both. What remains undisputed is that Jackson chose to spend eternity exactly where he wanted, on his own land, beside the woman he considered central to his life, regardless of what history would eventually say about his presidency. And speaking of presidents buried among family rather than in grand isolated monuments, our next stop takes us to a quiet cemetery in upstate New York for Martin Van Buren. Number 9. Martin Van Buren's family plot. Martin Van Buren, the 8th president and the first to be born an American citizen rather than a British subject, chose a burial arrangement that reflected his roots rather than his time in national politics. After leaving the presidency, Van Buren returned to Kinderhook, New York, the small town where he'd grown up, and where his political career had first taken shape decades earlier. When he died in 1862, he was buried in the Kinderhook Reformed Church Cemetery, a modest local burial ground rather than anything resembling a grand national memorial. What makes Van Buren's burial site particularly interesting is the company he keeps. Several of his relatives are buried in that same cemetery, creating something closer to a family plot than a dedicated presidential memorial. Some historians view this as consistent with Van Buren's personality and political philosophy. He was, after all, a master of local political organizing before rising to national prominence, someone deeply rooted in New York political machinery and community ties, choosing to be buried among family in his hometown rather than somewhere more symbolically national fits that pattern. Others note that during Van Buren's era, elaborate national memorials for former presidents simply weren't yet the norm, and returning home for burial was still a fairly common practice among former office holders. The cemetery itself remains relatively modest by presidential standards, without the towering obelisks or Gothic ironwork seen at some other presidential resting places. A simple monument marks his grave, listing his name and dates, without excessive ornamentation. Some historians suggest this reflects Van Buren's own understated approach to legacy, especially compared to contemporaries who sought grander memorialization. Others argue it simply reflects the financial and cultural norms of the time, when presidential burials hadn't yet evolved into the elaborate historical productions we associate with later commemorations. Either way, Van Buren's resting place offers a quiet contrast to the increasingly elaborate presidential memorials that would follow in later decades, a reminder that not every president sought grandeur in death, even after achieving the highest office in the land. And speaking of presidents whose deaths sparked far more controversy than their quiet burials might suggest, our next story takes a much darker turn. Number 10. William Henry Harrison's largest early funeral. William Henry Harrison holds a grim distinction in presidential history. He was the first president to die in office, and his death came shockingly fast. Inaugurated on March 4, 1841, Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, nearly 2 hours in cold, wet weather without a coat or hat. Whether that speech actually caused his illness remains debated among historians. Some argue the timeline doesn't quite support the popular legend, but what's certain is that Harrison fell seriously ill within weeks and died on April 4th, just 31 days into his presidency. The nation had never faced this situation before. There was no precedent for how to handle the death of a sitting president, and the government essentially had to invent the process on the spot. What resulted was one of the largest public funerals the young nation had ever seen. Washington, D.C. transformed into a city of mourning. Black crepe-draped windows and doorways throughout the Capitol. Government offices closed. A funeral procession wound through the streets featuring a horse-drawn hearse, military escorts, and what some accounts describe as a riderless horse with boots reversed in the stirrups, a symbol traditionally representing a fallen leader. Thousands of spectators lined the streets to watch the procession pass, many of them having never witnessed anything like it in their lifetimes. Congress, uncertain of exactly how to proceed constitutionally, scrambled to establish protocols that would later inform how the nation handled the deaths of future presidents. Harrison was temporarily interred in the Congressional Cemetery vault in Washington before his body was eventually transported back to Ohio, where he was permanently buried at North Bend, overlooking the Ohio River near his family estate. Some historians view Harrison's funeral as inadvertently setting the template for presidential mourning rituals going forward, establishing an unofficial standard for how the country would publicly grieve its leaders. Others note that much of the elaborate mourning reflected sheer shock and improvisation rather than any deliberate design. The country simply didn't know what else to do. Either way, Harrison's death and funeral marked a turning point, transforming the passing of a president from a private family matter into a full-blown national event, one that later administrations would study, refine, and expand upon for generations to come. And speaking of presidential funerals, shaped by political division rather than national unity, our next stop takes us straight into the heart of a divided country during its darkest chapter. Number 11. John Tyler's Confederate flag. John Tyler's funeral remains one of the most politically loaded events in presidential history, and it has almost nothing to do with his time as president. Tyler served from 1841 to 1845, largely remembered for his contentious relationship with Congress and his own party, but it's what happened after his presidency that makes his death so uniquely controversial. By the time Tyler died in January 1862, the United States had split apart, and Tyler had sided firmly with the Confederacy. He'd been elected to the Confederate House of Representatives, actively supporting secession and the new Confederate government, making him the only former U.S. president to formally align himself with a rebellion against the government he once led. When he died in Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, his funeral reflected exactly where his loyalties stood. Confederate officials organized the ceremony, Confederate flags were displayed prominently, and Tyler was honored with full Confederate state recognition rather than any acknowledgement from the United States government he'd once served as commander-in-chief. The Union government, understandably, offered no official mourning or recognition whatsoever. As far as Washington was concerned, Tyler had become a traitor, and his death barely registered as presidential news in the North. He was laid to rest at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, a burial ground that would later become the resting place for numerous Confederate soldiers and officials, situated not far from the grave of James Monroe, another former president buried there. Some historians argue Tyler's Confederate funeral represents one of the strangest footnotes in presidential history, a former U.S. head of state honored by a government actively at war with the nation he once led. Others point out that Tyler's actions were consistent with his lifelong political identity as a staunch states' rights advocate from Virginia, and that his choice to side with the Confederacy, while controversial, wasn't necessarily contradictory to positions he'd held throughout his career. Either way, Tyler occupies a bizarre and uncomfortable space in presidential history, honored in death by a government that didn't exist during his presidency and that was actively fighting against the country he once represented. His grave wasn't formally recognized with a presidential monument by the United States government until decades later, long after the wounds of the Civil War had at least partially healed. And speaking of presidents whose final resting places went through far more changes than anyone might expect, let's head to Tennessee for a story involving not one but several burial locations. Number 12. James K. Polk's temporary tomb. James K. Polk's journey to his final resting place turned out to be surprisingly complicated, involving multiple moves, legal disputes, and enough uncertainty to keep historians and genealogists busy for over a century. Polk died in June 1849, just months after leaving office, having served only a single term as president by his own choice. He was initially buried at Nashville City Cemetery, a fairly standard public burial ground, but this was never meant to be permanent. Polk's will had specified that he wished to be buried at his Nashville estate, Polk Place, and within about a year, his remains were exhumed and moved there, placed in a tomb constructed specifically to honor him on his own property. For decades, that arrangement seemed settled. Polk rested at his home, much like Andrew Jackson had chosen to do at the Hermitage. But unlike Jackson's estate, Polk Place didn't remain in family hands indefinitely. After the deaths of Polk's widow, Sarah, and the eventual sale of the property, legal and family disputes arose over what should happen to the tomb. Since the estate was being sold and redeveloped, keeping a presidential burial site on private land no longer occupied by family became increasingly impractical. Eventually, Polk's remains were moved once again, this time to the grounds of the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville, where they remain today, a public government-owned location rather than a private family site. Some historians argued this final resettlement made sense, placing Polk in a location tied to public service rather than a private estate that had passed out of family control. Others note the irony of a president being moved so many times after death, effectively being relocated based on real estate transactions rather than any deeply symbolic decision. In more recent years, there's even been public debate and legal proceedings over whether Polk's remains should be moved yet again, this time to a Polk ancestral home in Columbia, Tennessee, a proposal that has sparked disagreement among historians, descendants, and state officials alike. Polk's resting place remains a rare example of a presidential burial site still actively being discussed and potentially subject to change, a reminder that even centuries later, decisions about where these men should permanently rest aren't always as settled as they seem. Number 13. Zachary Taylor's exhumation. Zachary Taylor's death in July 1850 seemed straightforward at the time. The president had attended a 4th of July celebration, reportedly consumed copious amounts of cold milk and cherries in the sweltering Washington heat, and fell severely ill within days. He died on July 9th, just 16 months into his presidency. Doctors at the time attributed his death to cholera morbus, a general term for severe gastrointestinal illness. For over a century, that explanation stood unchallenged. Taylor was buried with appropriate presidential honors, and the nation moved on. But in the 1980s, a persistent theory began circulating that Taylor hadn't died from natural causes at all. The claim suggested he'd been poisoned with arsenic, potentially by pro-slavery politicians who saw Taylor, despite being a slaveholder himself, as an obstacle to their expansion plans because of his stance on new territories. The theory gained enough traction that in 1991, nearly a century and a half after his death, officials agreed to something almost unheard of. Taylor's body was exhumed from his tomb in Louisville, Kentucky. Forensic toxicologists carefully extracted samples of hair, fingernails, and tissue, testing them for elevated arsenic levels. The scientific results, when they finally came back, showed arsenic levels far too low to indicate poisoning. The amounts detected were consistent with normal environmental exposure for someone living in the 19th century, when arsenic was present in various everyday products. The original diagnosis, some sort of severe gastrointestinal illness, likely worsened by the primitive medical treatments of the era, including aggressive bloodletting and various toxic remedies doctors administered trying to help him, was essentially confirmed. Taylor probably died from a combination of a foodborne illness and the medical care that was supposed to save him. Some historians argue this exhumation demonstrated responsible historical inquiry, using modern science to definitively settle a persistent conspiracy theory rather than letting speculation continue indefinitely. Others question whether disturbing a president's remains for a theory that most serious historians considered unlikely from the start was really necessary or respectful. Either way, Taylor was reinterred with the same honors, and his tomb now carries the unusual distinction of being one of the only presidential burial sites to undergo modern forensic examination, a strange footnote for a president whose actual time in office gets far less attention than the mystery surrounding his death. And speaking of presidents whose final resting places reflect quieter, more understated legacies, let's head to Buffalo for a monument that doesn't get nearly the attention some other presidential graves receive. Number 14. Millard Fillmore's Buffalo Obelisk. Millard Fillmore doesn't rank among the presidents Americans think about often, and his final resting place reflects that relatively modest historical footprint. Fillmore served from 1850 to 1853, ascending to the presidency after Zachary Taylor's death, and he's remembered today largely for signing the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the Compromise of 1850, a decision that continues to generate debate among historians about its long-term consequences. When Fillmore died in March 1874, he was buried in Buffalo, New York, a city he'd called home for much of his life, and where he'd remained active in civic affairs even after leaving the White House. His grave sits in Forest Lawn Cemetery, marked by a substantial granite obelisk that rises above the surrounding plots. It's an elegant, if relatively simple, monument compared to some of the grander presidential memorials found elsewhere in the country. Buried alongside him are his wife, Abigail, and his daughter, Mary Abigail, creating a family plot rather than an isolated presidential shrine. Forest Lawn Cemetery itself is a sprawling, park-like burial ground, and Fillmore's grave sits among thousands of other Buffalo residents, without the heavy security or constant tourist presence found at sites like Arlington or the Lincoln Memorial. Some historians view this as fitting. Fillmore was a relatively unremarkable president by most rankings, and his understated burial site reflects that historical reality without excessive embellishment. Others argue the modesty of his grave has contributed to his broader historical obscurity, noting that presidents with more elaborate publicized memorials tend to stay more prominent in public memory regardless of their actual accomplishments in office. The obelisk itself carries a straightforward inscription noting his name, dates, and presidential service, without extensive commentary on his policies or legacy. Local historical societies in Buffalo have worked over the years to maintain interest in the site, organizing occasional tours and educational programs, but Fillmore's grave remains far less visited than those of more celebrated presidents. It stands as a quiet reminder that not every presidential burial site becomes a major historical destination, and that the physical monuments we build often reflect how history chooses to remember, or forget, the people buried beneath them. And speaking of presidents whose funerals mirrored a broader retreat from public life, let's travel to New Hampshire for a service defined by silence rather than spectacle. Number 15. Franklin Pierce's private funeral. Franklin Pierce's presidency, from 1853 to 1857, is often remembered as one marked by personal tragedy and political struggle, and that same quiet sorrow followed him well beyond the White House. Before even taking office, Pierce and his wife Jane endured the devastating loss of their young son Benjamin in a train accident, a tragedy that cast a shadow over his entire presidency and left him deeply affected for the rest of his life. After leaving office, Pierce largely withdrew from public affairs, his reputation further complicated by his sympathetic stance toward the South in the years leading up to the Civil War, a position that made him deeply unpopular in the North during and after the conflict. By the time Pierce died in October 1869, he had become something of a forgotten figure, largely disconnected from the political and social circles that once surrounded him. Reflecting this withdrawal, his funeral in Concord, New Hampshire, was deliberately modest and private, a stark contrast to the elaborate public mournings held for figures like Lincoln or William Henry Harrison. There were no massive processions through the streets, no nationwide displays of mourning, no lying in state before throngs of grieving citizens. Instead, Pierce was laid to rest with a relatively small, subdued ceremony, attended primarily by close family, friends, and local dignitaries. Some historians argue this quiet farewell was entirely consistent with how Pierce had chosen to live the final years of his life, deliberately avoiding the spotlight after enduring both personal tragedy and public scorn for his political positions. Others suggest the modest funeral also reflected the country's ambivalence toward Pierce's legacy, particularly given his perceived sympathies during a war that had only recently ended, and few Americans felt compelled to publicly honor a president many blamed for failing to prevent the national crisis that followed his term. He was buried in the Old North Cemetery in Concord, a relatively simple grave without the grandiose monuments seen elsewhere. Pierce's understated funeral stands as a reminder that not every presidential passing becomes a moment of national reflection. Sometimes a quiet exit is simply the final chapter of a life that had already withdrawn from the public stage long before death arrived. Number 16. James Buchanan's reserved burial. James Buchanan holds a unique and rather uncomfortable place in American history as the president whose term immediately preceded the Civil War, and many historians argue his indecisive handling of the secession crisis in his final months in office helped set the stage for the conflict that followed. Whether or not that assessment is entirely fair, Buchanan left the presidency in 1861 deeply unpopular, and he spent his remaining years largely out of the public eye at his wheatland estate near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. When he died in June 1868, his funeral reflected that same low-key withdrawal from public life. There was no elaborate state funeral, no massive procession through the Capitol, none of the pageantry that would come to define later presidential send-offs. Instead, Buchanan was buried in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in Woodward Hill Cemetery, laid to rest beside family members in a tomb marked by a relatively simple monument. The service was attended primarily by local residents, former associates, and a modest gathering of dignitaries, rather than the sprawling crowds that turned out for figures like Lincoln. Some historians suggest this understated farewell was fitting, given Buchanan's controversial legacy. The nation was still reeling from a war many blamed him for failing to prevent, and there was little public appetite for celebrating his life and service. Others argue the modest burial simply reflected personal preference. Buchanan had always been a reserved, cautious figure, more comfortable with quiet diplomacy than public spectacle, and his funeral mirrored that same restrained temperament. His monument in Lancaster carries a straightforward inscription noting his name, dates, and presidential service, without any attempt to soften or elaborate on the controversies that defined his final years in office. Unlike some presidents whose graves became pilgrimage sites for supporters or historians eager to reassess their legacies, Buchanan's tomb remains a relatively quiet corner of Pennsylvania history, visited mostly by those with a specific interest in the pre-Civil War political landscape. It stands as a reminder that not every president gets the benefit of a sympathetic historical rehabilitation. Sometimes the manner of your burial simply reflects how thoroughly the nation wanted to move on. And speaking of presidents whose deaths triggered exactly the opposite reaction, an outpouring of grief so massive it required its own moving monument. Let's talk about the funeral train that crossed half the country. Number 17. Abraham Lincoln's 1,700-mile funeral train. If Buchanan's funeral represented quiet withdrawal, Lincoln's represented the complete opposite, a nationwide spectacle of mourning unlike anything the country had seen before. After his assassination in April 1865, Lincoln's body began an extraordinary journey, a funeral train that carried his coffin from Washington, D.C., all the way to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois, covering roughly 1,700 miles and passing through 7 states along the way. The train essentially retraced the route Lincoln had taken to reach his inauguration 4 years earlier, only this time draped in black and moving at a deliberately slow pace so mourners could witness it passing through their towns. At nearly every stop, the coffin was removed from the train and put on public display, allowing hundreds of thousands of grieving citizens to file past and pay their respects. Some cities held elaborate ceremonies with military honor guards, while smaller towns simply gathered along the tracks as the train rolled through, hoping for a glimpse of the funeral car. Estimates suggest that more than 1 million people viewed Lincoln's body directly during the journey, while millions more lined the route just to watch the train pass. The scale of public mourning was unprecedented, reflecting both the shock of assassination and the deep national grief following 4 years of brutal civil war. Some historians argue this extended funeral procession served an important political purpose beyond simple mourning, allowing a fractured nation to collectively process both Lincoln's death and the end of the war in a shared, highly visible ritual. Others note the journey also created logistical nightmares, coordinating security, embalming, and public viewings across multiple states and cities was an enormous undertaking for 1865, and reports suggest Lincoln's body deteriorated noticeably by the time it reached its final destination. Either way, the funeral train remains one of the most extraordinary displays of collective mourning in American history, a physical journey that mirrored the emotional journey of a nation trying to process an unthinkable loss. And speaking of Lincoln's remains having anything but a peaceful, uneventful rest, the story of his actual burial gets stranger from here. Number 18. Lincoln's repeated reburials. You might assume that once Lincoln's funeral train reached Springfield and his body was placed in a tomb, that would be the end of the story. It wasn't. Lincoln's coffin was moved repeatedly over the following decades, for reasons ranging from construction delays to genuine concerns about grave robbers targeting his remains. In fact, in 1876, a gang of counterfeiters attempted to actually steal Lincoln's body, planning to hold it for ransom, an audacious plot that was foiled at the last moment thanks to an informant. That attempted theft alone prompted authorities to take Lincoln's security far more seriously, and his coffin was relocated multiple times within the tomb complex as officials scrambled to find a truly secure resting place. Some historians argue these repeated relocations reflect just how seriously 19th century Americans took the threat of grave robbery, a genuine concern during an era when bodies, especially famous ones, were sometimes targeted for ransom or even sold to medical schools. Others point out the almost absurd irony that the most revered president in American history couldn't seem to stay buried in one place for more than a few years at a time. Eventually, in 1901, officials decided enough was enough. Lincoln's coffin was secured beneath a massive vault of concrete at his Springfield tomb, several feet thick, essentially entombing him in a way that made future theft or relocation practically impossible. The process reportedly required witnesses to confirm the body was actually Lincoln's before the concrete was poured, leading to one final, eerie viewing of his remains over 3 decades after his assassination. Some historians see this final concrete burial as an appropriate, if unusually elaborate conclusion to Lincoln's long and complicated relationship with rest and remembrance. Others argue it reflects something particularly American about our presidents. Even in death, they rarely get to simply be left alone. Lincoln's tomb today stands as one of the most visited presidential memorials in the country, a fitting final chapter for a president whose funeral, journey, and burial all became historic events in their own right. Number 19. The attempted theft of Lincoln's body. We just talked about how Lincoln's remains were moved and reburied repeatedly, but the actual theft attempt that kicked off decades of paranoia deserves its own closer look because the plot itself was almost cartoonishly bold. In 1876, A gang of Chicago counterfeiters hatched a scheme to steal Lincoln's body directly from his tomb and hold it for ransom. Their real goal wasn't money exactly, it was leverage. They wanted to use the stolen corpse to negotiate the release of their master engraver, a man skilled at producing fake currency who was sitting in prison. The plan involved breaking into the tomb at night, removing the casket, and smuggling it across state lines before authorities even realized what happened. What the counterfeiters didn't know was that the Secret Service, which at the time existed primarily to combat currency counterfeiting rather than protect presidents, had already infiltrated their operation with an undercover informant. Agents were waiting inside the tomb when the thieves broke in, and the plot collapsed almost immediately, though in the chaos of the arrest, the gang actually escaped empty-handed before eventually being caught. The incident sent shockwaves through the country. If Lincoln's body wasn't safe, whose was? Officials realized that a simple marble tomb offered essentially no real protection against determined grave robbers, and this triggered a complete rethink of how Lincoln's remains would be secured going forward. In the years following the attempt, Lincoln's coffin was deliberately hidden, moved to undisclosed locations within the tomb complex, and eventually buried beneath layers of brick and steel cages specifically designed to make future theft impossible. Some historians argue this attempted heist inadvertently helped shape early American attitudes towards securing historical monuments and presidential burial sites more broadly, treating them less like simple graves and more like protected national assets. Others point out the almost darkly comic irony that Lincoln, already a martyr and national symbol, nearly became the target of a ransom scheme better suited to a pulp novel than sober American history. Either way, the failed 1876 theft is the direct reason Lincoln's tomb eventually received the massive concrete reinforcement we mentioned earlier, a permanent, almost paranoid level of security built entirely because a handful of counterfeiters once thought grave robbing a president was a viable business plan. And speaking of presidents whose burials involved unusual objects placed with surprising intentionality, let's talk about Andrew Johnson's rather symbolic choice of bedding. Number 20. Andrew Johnson's flag as a pillow. Andrew Johnson's presidency was defined by conflict, taking over after Lincoln's assassination, clashing repeatedly with Congress, and becoming the first president to be impeached, though he narrowly avoided removal from office by a single vote in the Senate. By the time he died in 1875, just 6 years after leaving the White House, Johnson remained a deeply polarizing figure, someone many Americans viewed as having badly mishandled the delicate work of post-Civil War Reconstruction. Yet his funeral arrangements reflected something almost defiantly patriotic, a final statement about his understanding of his own role in the nation's history. Johnson was buried in Greenville, Tennessee, wrapped in an American flag, with his body positioned so that a copy of the United States Constitution rested beneath his head, essentially serving as his pillow for eternity. This wasn't an accident or a casual choice. It was specifically requested, a deliberate final message from a man who spent his presidency arguing, often unsuccessfully, that he was the true defender of constitutional government against an overreaching Congress. Some historians suggest this choice reflects Johnson's genuine, sincere belief that history would eventually vindicate his strict interpretation of presidential authority and constitutional limits, even though his contemporaries largely viewed his Reconstruction policies as a disastrous failure that allowed the post-war South to reassert white supremacist control. Others argue the flag and Constitution were less about principle and more about legacy management, a carefully staged final image designed to reframe a controversial presidency as one rooted in constitutional fidelity rather than obstruction and failure. Whatever the true motivation, the symbolism was impossible to miss. Johnson essentially buried himself as a martyr for the Constitution, even as most of the country remembered him as the president who nearly got removed from office and who badly bungled the aftermath of the Civil War. His grave site in Greenville, now part of the Andrew Johnson National Cemetery, still tells this story today, a monument built by a man determined to control his own historical narrative right down to the very last detail of how his body was arranged. And speaking of presidents whose final resting places became architectural statements far larger than the men themselves, let's head to New York City for one of the most massive presidential tombs in the country. Number 21. Ulysses S. Grant's Riverside Tomb. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who led the North to victory in the Civil War and later served 2 terms as president, died in 1885 after a brutal battle with throat cancer, spending his final months desperately writing his memoirs to secure his family's financial future after being wiped out by a business fraud scheme. When he passed away, the country responded with a memorial project on a genuinely massive scale. Grant's tomb, officially known as the General Grant National Memorial, was built overlooking the Hudson River in Manhattan, and upon completion in 1897, it became the largest mausoleum in North America, a title it still holds today. The structure took 12 years to complete and was funded largely through public donations, an enormous outpouring of support reflecting Grant's status as the man who preserved the Union. Over 1 million people reportedly attended the tomb's dedication ceremony, one of the largest public gatherings in American history up to that point. Inside, twin sarcophagi hold both Grant and his wife Julia, who was buried alongside him after her death in 1902, making the tomb a shared resting place rather than a solitary presidential monument. Some historians argue the sheer scale of Grant's tomb reflects how differently Americans viewed him compared to civilian presidents, his military legacy as the general who won the Civil War often overshadowing, and in some ways elevating, his more complicated and scandal-plagued presidency. Others note the tomb's massive scale eventually became something of a punchline, popularized by the old joke, "Who's buried in Grant's tomb?" precisely because the answer, both Grant and Julia together, is more architecturally elaborate than most people expect. Regardless, the monument remains a striking piece of presidential memorial history, a riverside colossus built for a man whose battlefield legacy earned him a burial site far grander than almost any other president in American history. And speaking of presidents whose bodies took a while to find their final resting place, let's talk about Rutherford B. Hayes and his surprisingly complicated path to Ohio soil. Number 22. Rutherford B. Hayes's Spiegel Grove burial. Hayes left office in 1881 after a single term defined by the contested election of 1876, a race so disputed that opponents nicknamed him Rutherford and questioned whether he'd actually won the presidency at all. Despite that rocky start, Hayes retired quietly to Ohio and spent his remaining years focused on prison reform, education, and various charitable causes, seemingly determined to prove his presidency had been more than just a backroom deal. When he died in 1893, Hayes was initially laid to rest at Oakwood Cemetery in Fremont, Ohio, alongside his beloved wife Lucy, who had passed away 3 years earlier. For a time, that seemed like the end of the story, a modest cemetery burial for a modest, if controversial, one-term president. But Hayes had actually expressed a wish to eventually be buried on the grounds of Spiegel Grove, his family's sprawling estate in Fremont, a property he'd spent decades expanding and cherishing as his true home. In 1915, more than 20 years after his death, Hayes's remains, along with Lucy's, were exhumed and moved to a new burial site right there on the Spiegel Grove property. Some historians suggest this delayed relocation reflects how presidential legacies often needed time to settle before communities felt moved to create a permanent, dedicated memorial space. Others point out that Hayes, despite his contested election, had actually earned a fair amount of quiet respect by the time of his death, respect that eventually translated into the effort and expense of moving 2 caskets to a more fitting location. The Spiegel Grove estate itself now houses the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum, the first presidential library in the country, making Hayes something of an accidental pioneer in how America chooses to honor its former leaders. Visitors today can walk the same grounds where Hayes once lived, gaze at the modest grave marker shaded by mature trees, and reflect on a presidency that began under a cloud of electoral controversy but ended with a peaceful, personally chosen resting place. It's a quiet irony that a man once mocked for supposedly stealing an election ended up with one of the more thoughtfully arranged, family-centered burial sites of any 19th century president. And speaking of presidents whose memorials reflect the shocking manner of their deaths, let's head to Cleveland for the towering tribute built for James Garfield. Number 23. James Garfield's Cleveland Memorial. Garfield's presidency lasted a mere 200 days before he was shot by a disappointed office seeker in 1881, then subjected to 11 weeks of agonizing medical treatment that likely did more harm than the bullet itself, as doctors repeatedly probed the wound with unsterilized fingers and instruments. When he finally died that September, the nation was gripped by a wave of grief and outrage, and Cleveland, Ohio, Garfield's adopted home state's largest city, decided his memorial needed to match the scale of that national mourning. The result was the Garfield Memorial at Lakeview Cemetery, an absolutely massive stone structure that looks more like a medieval castle than a typical presidential tomb. Standing nearly 180 feet tall, the memorial includes an ornate crypt where Garfield and his wife Lucretia are both interred, along with intricate stained glass windows depicting scenes from his life and military service. The structure also features detailed relief carvings commemorating Garfield's Civil War service, since he had risen to the rank of Major General before entering politics. Some historians argue the memorial's grandeur reflects genuine public shock at watching a president suffer for weeks from a wound that modern medicine would have treated easily, a slow, preventable death that left Americans desperate to memorialize him properly. Others suggest the monument's scale was also a calculated statement, an effort to cement Garfield's legacy despite an incredibly short presidency that left him little time to actually accomplish much of anything policy-wise. Funded largely through public donations, much like Grant's tomb we mentioned earlier, the Garfield Memorial demonstrates how 19th century Americans often use architectural grandeur to compensate for presidencies cut tragically short. Today, visitors can climb to an observation deck near the top of the memorial for sweeping views of Lake Erie, a strange but fitting reward for anyone willing to explore this elaborate tribute to a president whose actual time in office barely lasted half a year. And speaking of presidential memorials that turned out considerably more modest than you might expect, let's talk about Chester A. Arthur's grave in Albany, number 24 Chester A. Arthur's modest memorial. Arthur became president after Garfield's assassination, inheriting the office almost by accident since he had originally been added to the ticket, mainly to balance party politics, rather than any expectation he'd actually lead the country. Surprisingly, Arthur turned out to be a fairly effective, reform-minded president, pushing through civil service reforms that reduced the very kind of political patronage system that had gotten Garfield killed in the first place. Despite this quiet success, Arthur never sought a full term of his own, partly because he was secretly battling a fatal kidney disease that he kept hidden from the public throughout much of his presidency. When he died in 1886, just a year after leaving office, Arthur was buried in Albany Rural Cemetery in New York, his home state, in a burial plot considerably more understated than the grand memorials built for men like Garfield or Grant. His grave is marked by a striking bronze angel sculpture created by Ephraim Kieser, a respected American sculptor known for his elegant, mournful funerary art. The angel figure kneels beside Arthur's sarcophagus, one hand resting gently upon it, a quiet, contemplative image rather than the towering castle-like structures other presidents received. Some historians suggest this relative modesty reflects Arthur's own personality, a man who valued quiet competence over public spectacle, someone who reformed government from the inside without seeking much personal glory for it. Others point out that Arthur's presidency, however successful, was still overshadowed by the fact that he'd never been elected in his own right, arriving in office only through tragedy and never quite escaping the shadow of the man he replaced. Whatever the reason, Arthur's grave remains a beautifully sculpted but comparatively understated memorial, easy to overlook in the broader landscape of presidential burial sites. Much like Arthur's presidency itself, has been largely overlooked in American historical memory, despite its genuine if quiet accomplishments. And speaking of presidents whose final resting places seem almost deliberately modest given their accomplishments, let's head back to Princeton, New Jersey, where Grover Cleveland's grave raises a few eyebrows of its own. Number 25. Grover Cleveland's Princeton grave. Cleveland holds the unique distinction of being the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, a political comeback so unusual that he remains the answer to one of America's favorite trivia questions. After leaving the White House for the second and final time in 1897, Cleveland settled into a quieter life in Princeton, New Jersey, where he became a popular lecturer and trustee at Princeton University, seemingly content to trade the pressures of the presidency for the relative calm of academic life. When he died in 1908, Cleveland was buried in Princeton Cemetery, a peaceful, tree-lined burial ground that had already become the resting place for numerous university faculty and prominent local families. His grave marker is strikingly simple, a modest flat stone bearing his name and dates, with none of the towering obelisks or elaborate sculptures that mark the graves of men like Garfield or Grant. For a president who served 2 full terms and remains the only individual in American history to do so non-consecutively, the understated nature of his final memorial seems almost surprising. Some historians suggest this simplicity reflects Cleveland's own personality, a man known for blunt honesty and a general disdain for political spectacle, someone who famously vetoed more bills than most of his predecessors combined, simply because he believed in fiscal restraint over showmanship. Others argue that by the time of his death, Cleveland's presidency had already faded somewhat from public memory, overshadowed by the economic panic of 1893 that occurred during his second term and the labor unrest that followed, including the controversial handling of the Pullman strike. Whatever the explanation, visitors to Princeton Cemetery today often walk right past Cleveland's grave without realizing they've passed the resting place of a 2-term president, a quiet irony for a man whose political career was defined by an equally quiet, understated resolve. It's a fitting, if unassuming, final chapter for a leader who seemed to prefer substance over spectacle throughout his entire public life. And speaking of presidential funerals that drew far larger crowds than the deceased actually wanted, let's travel to Indianapolis for Benjamin Harrison's surprisingly massive send-off. Number 26. Benjamin Harrison's Indianapolis procession. Harrison served a single term from 1889 to 1893, sandwiched neatly between Cleveland's 2 non-consecutive terms, a presidency often remembered for expanding the Navy and admitting a record 6 states into the Union. After losing his re-election bid to Cleveland, Harrison returned to his law practice in Indianapolis, seemingly stepping back from public life with little fanfare, much like many one-term presidents before and after him. When he died in 1901 from complications related to pneumonia, Harrison's family and close associates reportedly understood that he preferred a relatively private, dignified service rather than an elaborate public spectacle. Indianapolis, however, had other plans. As word of his death spread through the city, enormous crowds began gathering, eager to pay their respects to a man who had become something of a local legend, not just as a former president, but as a respected attorney and civic figure within the community. The funeral procession that followed drew tens of thousands of mourners lining the streets, far more than anyone anticipated for a president whose single term had ended in electoral defeat just 8 years earlier. Some historians suggest this outpouring reflects how local pride often outweighs national political memory, with Indianapolis residents viewing Harrison less as a one-term president and more as one of their own, a hometown figure deserving of a grand civic tribute regardless of his broader national legacy. Others point out that Harrison's death coincided with a period of relative peace and prosperity in America, giving the public an opportunity to reflect fondly on a presidency that, while not spectacular, had been steady and competent. Harrison was ultimately buried at Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, a burial ground that would eventually become the resting place for several notable American figures. Despite his personal wishes for a modest farewell, the sheer scale of public mourning turned his funeral into one of the largest civic events Indianapolis had ever witnessed, a striking reminder that sometimes communities honor their own regardless of what the deceased actually requested. And speaking of funerals that turned into elaborate public spectacles following a president's sudden and violent death, let's discuss William McKinley's strikingly visual send-off after his assassination in 1901. Number 27. William McKinley's glass-covered casket. McKinley's presidency came to a shocking end in September 1901, when he was shot by an anarchist while greeting the public at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, becoming the 3rd American president to be assassinated in less than 40 years. His death sent the nation into a period of mourning reminiscent of the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination decades earlier, complete with elaborate funeral arrangements designed to allow as many Americans as possible to pay their final respects. Central to those arrangements was an unusual choice, a glass-covered casket that allowed mourners filing past to actually view McKinley's body during the public viewing portions of the funeral proceedings. This practice, while not entirely unheard of during the era, created a particularly striking and somber visual experience for the thousands who came to see their fallen president one final time. McKinley's body first lay in state at Buffalo City Hall, where enormous crowds filed past the glass-covered casket before being transported by train to Washington, D.C., for additional services at the Capitol Rotunda. From there, his body traveled once more, this time to his final resting place in Canton, Ohio, where he would eventually be interred in an elaborate memorial built specifically to honor him. Some historians suggest the glass-covered casket reflected a broader cultural fascination of the era with viewing the deceased, a practice tied to Victorian mourning customs that emphasized visible, tangible connections between the living and the dead. Others argue that allowing the public to actually see McKinley's body served a political purpose as well, providing visible proof that the president had truly died from his wounds, quelling any potential rumors or conspiracy theories that might otherwise have circulated in an era before mass media could quickly confirm such events. The sheer scale of public viewing, combined with the visual nature of the glass-covered casket, turned McKinley's funeral into one of the most elaborately staged presidential farewells of the early 20th century, a stark contrast to the far more modest, understated burials of contemporaries like Cleveland and Harrison. It stands as a reminder that the manner of a president's death often shapes the scale and style of their memorial, far more than their actual accomplishments in office ever could. And speaking of elaborate memorials built to honor a fallen president, let's go back to Canton, Ohio, where McKinley's final resting place included a surprisingly theatrical architectural feature that most Americans have completely forgotten about. Number 28, the McKinley Memorial's water feature. After McKinley's assassination shocked the nation in 1901, a massive fundraising effort began almost immediately to construct a memorial worthy of the fallen president, one that would properly honor a man who had led the country through the Spanish-American War and into a new century of American industrial and global influence. The result was the McKinley National Memorial in Canton, Ohio, a striking granite structure completed in 1907 that features a broad, monumental staircase leading up to a domed mausoleum where McKinley and his wife Ida are entombed. What many visitors today don't realize, however, is that the original design and early years of the memorial included a dramatic cascading water feature, a series of fountains and pools positioned along the approach to the staircase that added a theatrical, almost ceremonial quality to the entire site. Some historical accounts suggest the water was meant to evoke a sense of eternal flow and renewal, a fitting symbolic gesture for a leader whose life had been cut short so suddenly and violently. Others argue the cascading water served a more practical architectural purpose, drawing the eye upward toward the staircase and dome while creating a sense of grandeur that matched the scale of public mourning McKinley's death had inspired across the country. Postcards and photographs from the early 20th century show visitors admiring the fountains as they made their way toward the memorial steps, suggesting the water feature was, at least for a time, a genuine highlight of the site, rather than a mere afterthought. Over the following decades, however, maintenance challenges and changing landscaping priorities led to the gradual removal or alteration of much of the original water feature, leaving today's visitors with a memorial that, while still impressive, lacks the theatrical flourish its designers originally intended. Some historians speculate this quiet disappearance mirrors McKinley's own fading presence in popular historical memory, a president whose assassination briefly made him a national symbol of grief before Theodore Roosevelt's larger-than-life presidency overshadowed his legacy almost entirely. Whatever the reason, the missing cascade remains a small but telling detail, a reminder that even memorials designed to be permanent and grand can quietly evolve, shrink, or vanish over time, much like public memory itself. And speaking of presidents whose burials were shaped by forces beyond anyone's control, let's head to Oyster Bay, New York, where Theodore Roosevelt's funeral had to contend with something as simple and unavoidable as the setting sun. Number 29. Theodore Roosevelt's Midnight Burial. Roosevelt died suddenly in his sleep at his beloved Sagamore Hill estate in January 1919, just a few years after leaving the presidency and following a period marked by personal tragedy, including the death of his youngest son Quentin in World War I. His death stunned the nation, given that Roosevelt had remained a vigorous, larger-than-life public figure right up until the end, someone many Americans still considered a potential future presidential candidate despite his advancing age and declining health. Because Roosevelt died in January, funeral arrangements had to work around the brutally short winter days common to the Northeast, where sunset arrives early and darkness settles in quickly. Roosevelt was buried at Young's Memorial Cemetery near Oyster Bay, a quiet, unassuming burial ground he had specifically requested rather than any grand national monument befitting a former president. The funeral service itself was delayed slightly due to the logistics of gathering mourners and preparing the site, and by the time burial proceedings actually began, the winter darkness had already fully descended, meaning Roosevelt was ultimately laid to rest shortly after sunset in conditions closer to nighttime than the bright ceremonial daylight burials often associated with presidential funerals. Some historians suggest this timing feels almost fittingly poetic for a man known for his boundless energy and refusal to slow down, even as his final journey to the grave occurred quite literally under cover of darkness. Others point out that the modest, low-key nature of the burial reflected Roosevelt's own wishes, a man who, despite his flamboyant public persona, genuinely wanted a simple, private farewell among family and close friends rather than an elaborate state funeral. The evening burial, combined with the small local cemetery he chose, stands in sharp contrast to the massive public mourning that followed his death nationwide, offering yet another example of how a president's personal preferences can shape a surprisingly understated final chapter, even when the entire country is grieving. And speaking of presidents whose burial choices quietly set precedents that future leaders would follow for generations, let's turn to William Howard Taft, whose final resting place broke entirely new ground. Number 30, William Howard Taft at Arlington. Taft holds the unique distinction of being the only person in American history to serve as both President of the United States and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a remarkable career that reflected his lifelong passion for law and judicial process, even more than executive politics. After leaving the presidency in 1913 following a single term marked by trust-busting efforts and internal Republican Party divisions, Taft eventually achieved his true dream job in 1921, when President Harding appointed him Chief Justice, a role he later described as more personally satisfying than the presidency itself. When Taft died in 1930, his family made a groundbreaking decision that would shape presidential burial traditions for decades to come, choosing Arlington National Cemetery as his final resting place. This made Taft the first president ever buried at Arlington, a cemetery originally established during the Civil War specifically for military honors rather than civilian or presidential burials. Some historians suggest this choice reflected Taft's deep respect for national service and military tradition, given his extensive government career that included roles as Secretary of War and Governor General of the Philippines prior to becoming president. Others point out that Arlington's solemn, dignified atmosphere, combined with its role as a symbol of collective national sacrifice, made it an especially fitting choice for a man who valued institutional service above personal legacy or political spectacle. Taft's burial at Arlington quietly established a precedent that had never existed before, transforming what had been an exclusively military and veteran burial ground into a site also capable of honoring the nation's highest civilian leaders. This precedent became especially significant decades later, when President John F. Kennedy was buried at Arlington following his assassination in 1963, a decision partly influenced by the existing example Taft had set more than 30 years earlier. Some historians argue that without Taft's earlier burial normalizing the idea of a president resting among Arlington's military dead, Kennedy's own iconic burial site, complete with its eternal flame, might have taken an entirely different form altogether. It's a quiet but significant reminder that even burial choices, seemingly personal and private decisions, can ripple forward through history, shaping national traditions in ways few people ever fully realize. And speaking of presidents whose burial locations quietly broke new ground in the nation's capital, let's talk about the only commander-in-chief who actually rests within the boundaries of Washington, D.C. itself. Number 31. Woodrow Wilson's Cathedral Tomb. Wilson led the country through World War I and helped shape the League of Nations, a vision for international cooperation that ultimately failed to gain American support, a bitter disappointment that some historians believe contributed to the physical and emotional decline he experienced in his final years. After suffering a debilitating stroke in 1919 that left him partially paralyzed and largely hidden from public view for the remainder of his presidency, Wilson left office in 1921 as a shadow of the vigorous reformer who had once dominated American politics. When he died in 1924, his family made an unusual choice that set him apart from every other president in American history. Rather than being buried in a family plot, a presidential library, or a hometown cemetery, Wilson was interred inside the Washington National Cathedral, an enormous Gothic structure that was still under construction at the time of his death, and wouldn't actually be completed until 1990. This makes Wilson the only president buried within the city of Washington, D.C. itself, a distinction that seems fitting, given how deeply his identity became tied to the federal government and international diplomacy during his time in office. Some historians suggest the cathedral burial reflected Wilson's own deeply held religious convictions, given that he was the son of a Presbyterian minister and often spoke of his policies in explicitly moral and spiritual terms throughout his presidency. Others argue the choice symbolized his lifelong commitment to institutions of permanence and moral authority, the same instincts that drove his push for the League of Nations even as the American public and Senate ultimately rejected it. Wilson's tomb sits in a quiet bay within the cathedral, marked by a relatively simple sarcophagus that contrasts sharply with the massive Gothic architecture surrounding it, drawing a steady stream of visitors who often stumble upon the burial almost by accident while touring the cathedral's soaring naves and stained glass windows. Some visitors report being struck by how understated the tomb feels compared to the grandeur of the building itself, a quiet resting place for a president whose grand international ambitions were ultimately left unfulfilled during his own lifetime. It's a fascinating footnote that reveals how even burial location can become a kind of historical statement, tying a president permanently to the seat of government he served rather than the hometown or family soil most other presidents chose for their final rest. And speaking of presidents whose sudden deaths triggered elaborate and highly public funeral logistics, let's turn to Warren G. Harding, whose final journey home involved one of the most dramatic cross-country train processions in presidential history. Number 32. Warren G. Harding's elaborate funeral train. Harding died unexpectedly in August 1923 while on a speaking tour through the western United States, collapsing in a San Francisco hotel room under circumstances that remain somewhat murky even today, with some historians speculating about possible heart failure while others have floated theories involving food poisoning or even foul play, though no credible evidence has ever supported anything beyond natural causes. Regardless of the exact medical explanation, Harding's sudden death thousands of miles from Washington created an immediate logistical challenge. How exactly do you transport a deceased president's body across an entire continent in an era before commercial air travel made such journeys quick and simple? The answer was an elaborate funeral train, a specially arranged procession that carried Harding's body from San Francisco all the way back to Washington, D.C., stopping in numerous cities along the route so that grieving Americans could pay their respects to a president many had genuinely admired despite the scandals that would later emerge and tarnish his legacy after his death. Crowds gathered at train stations across the country, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, as the funeral train slowly made its way eastward, a journey that took several days and became a genuine moment of national mourning that briefly united Americans regardless of political affiliation. Newspapers described enormous crowds standing silently as the train passed, men removing their hats, women weeping, children held up by parents so they could witness what felt like a genuinely historic moment unfolding before their eyes. Some historians suggest this elaborate public mourning reflected genuine affection for Harding, a president often remembered today primarily for the Teapot Dome scandal and other corruption that emerged posthumously, but who was, during his lifetime, considered warm, approachable, and genuinely well-liked by ordinary Americans. Others argue the scale of the funeral train procession says less about Harding specifically and more about the era itself, a time when presidential deaths, especially sudden and unexpected ones, produced massive outpourings of public grief regardless of the individual president's specific policy record or personal conduct. The funeral train eventually arrived in Washington, where Harding lay in state before ultimately being buried in Marion, Ohio, his hometown, a final resting place chosen specifically to honor his roots rather than any national monument or cemetery in the capital. It remains one of the most elaborate transportation efforts ever undertaken for a presidential funeral, a reminder of just how differently death, mourning, and public spectacle intersected in the early 20th century. And speaking of presidents who chose deeply personal, almost hidden burial locations far from the political spotlight, let's head to a quiet Vermont village where Calvin Coolidge's final resting place reflects the understated personality he was famous for throughout his entire political career. Number 33. Calvin Coolidge's Vermont grave. Coolidge, often remembered for his famously reserved personality and nickname Silent Cal, served as president throughout much of the 1920s, presiding over a period of economic prosperity that would come crashing down shortly after he left office, though few historians blame him directly for the Great Depression that followed under his successor Herbert Hoover. When Coolidge died in 1933, just a few years after leaving the presidency, His family chose to bury him not in any grand national cemetery or elaborate memorial, but in the small, unassuming Plymouth Notch Cemetery in Vermont, the same rural village where he had been born, and where he famously took his presidential oath of office in his father's farmhouse living room after the sudden death of President Harding. Coolidge's grave sits alongside numerous family members, including his father, his wife's relatives, and most poignantly, his teenage son Calvin Jr., who had died tragically in 1924 from a blood infection that began as a simple blister from playing tennis on the White House lawn. A devastating loss that Coolidge himself later said took the joy and much of the ambition out of his presidency entirely. Some historians suggest the choice to bury Coolidge among his family in Plymouth Notch reflects his deeply rooted New England values, a lifelong preference for simplicity, humility, and rural authenticity over the grandeur and spectacle that increasingly characterized American political life during his time in office. Others point out that being buried near his son likely carried enormous personal significance, offering Coolidge a permanent physical connection to a loss that clearly haunted him privately, even as he maintained his famously stoic public demeanor throughout the remainder of his presidency and life. The gravestone itself is remarkably modest, a simple marker bearing only his name and dates, indistinguishable at first glance from the surrounding family graves except for a small presidential seal that quietly identifies his unique place in American history. Visitors today often remark on how strikingly understated the site feels compared to the sprawling libraries and monumental memorials associated with more modern presidents, a fitting final chapter for a man who built his entire political identity around restraint, modesty, and a deep skepticism of excessive government spectacle in all its forms. And speaking of presidents whose final resting places circled back to the humble towns where their stories first began, let's head to a small farming community in Iowa, where Herbert Hoover's life came full circle in a way that surprised almost no one who understood his character. Number 34. Herbert Hoover's West Branch Burial. Hoover was born in 1874 in the tiny village of West Branch, Iowa, the son of a Quaker blacksmith, and he was orphaned by the age of 9, a childhood marked by hardship that stood in stark contrast to the globe-trotting life he would eventually build for himself as a mining engineer and businessman. Before ever entering politics, Hoover lived and worked across the world, spending years in Australia, China, and London, accumulating both wealth and an international reputation for humanitarian relief efforts that made him famous long before he ever ran for president. By the time he reached the White House in 1929, Hoover had spent the vast majority of his adult life far removed from the small Iowa town where he'd been born, a fact that makes his eventual burial choice all the more striking. Despite decades spent overseas and later in Washington, Hoover chose to be laid to rest in West Branch, the same modest village where his journey had started, alongside his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, who had originally been buried in California following her death in 1944, but was later reinterred beside him after his own death in 1964. Some historians suggest this choice reflected Hoover's deep Quaker roots, a lifelong sense of humility and simplicity that persisted even after he became one of the most internationally traveled men to ever hold the presidency. Others argue the return to West Branch was almost a symbolic act of redemption, an attempt to reconnect with a simpler, more innocent identity following a presidency that became permanently associated with the onset of the Great Depression, a legacy Hoover spent the remaining 3 decades of his long life trying to reshape through humanitarian work and public service. Hoover lived remarkably long after leaving office, dying at age 90, and by the time of his death, public opinion had softened somewhat, allowing his final resting place to become less about political reckoning and more about honoring the full arc of an extraordinary American life. Today, the graves sit within the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site, a quiet stretch of preserved prairie landscape that includes his birthplace cottage, a presidential library, and the simple gravesite itself, drawing visitors who often express surprise at just how understated the setting feels compared to the global scale of Hoover's actual life story. It's a fitting final chapter for a man whose presidency is still debated by historians, some blaming his policies for deepening the economic collapse of the 1930s, others arguing external global forces were far more responsible than any single administration could have controlled, but whose personal choice of burial site left no ambiguity about where he considered his story to have truly begun. And speaking of presidents who chose to return to their family estates rather than any grand national memorial, let's travel to the Hudson Valley of New York, where Franklin D. Roosevelt arranged for his own burial in a strikingly personal and quietly symbolic location. Number 35. Franklin D. Roosevelt's Rose Garden Grave. Roosevelt, the only president to serve more than 2 terms and the man who guided the nation through both the Great Depression and most of World War II, died suddenly in April 1945 while at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, just months before the war in Europe finally came to an end. His body was transported back to Washington by funeral train, drawing enormous crowds along the route in scenes reminiscent of the outpouring that had followed Warren Harding's death 2 decades earlier, before ultimately continuing on to Hyde Park, New York, the Roosevelt family estate where Franklin had actually been born in 1882. Rather than being buried in a cemetery or a separate memorial site, Roosevelt chose to be laid to rest in the rose garden of his childhood home, a space that had been carefully designed and maintained by his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, and that held deep personal significance for him long before he ever became a national political figure. Some historians suggest this choice reflected Roosevelt's genuine attachment to Springwood, the family estate where he'd spent his childhood summers and to which he returned throughout his life, even during the most demanding years of his presidency. Others argue the burial site represented a deliberate blending of the personal and the political, situating his grave directly adjacent to what would become the first presidential library in American history, a project Roosevelt himself helped conceive and establish before his death, permanently linking his final resting place to the institution that would preserve and interpret his legacy for future generations. Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife and one of the most influential first ladies in American history, continued her own extensive public service for nearly 2 decades after his death, before being buried beside him in the same rose garden in 1962, reuniting the couple in the same quiet garden setting they had known since childhood. Today, the site is maintained as part of the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt National Historic Site, drawing visitors who often note how modest and intimate the grave feels, a simple marble marker surrounded by rose bushes, especially when compared to the scale of the era Roosevelt presided over and the sweeping global consequences of the decisions he made during his presidency. It remains one of the most personally meaningful presidential burial sites in the country, a quiet garden resting place for a man whose public life reshaped much of the 20th century. And speaking of presidents who tied their final resting place directly to the institutions built to preserve their legacies, let's head to Independence, Missouri, where Harry Truman chose an unusually intimate connection between his grave and his own presidential library. Number 36. Harry Truman's Library Courtyard Burial. Truman assumed the presidency unexpectedly in April 1945 following Roosevelt's sudden death, inheriting a nation still fighting a global war and facing some of the most consequential decisions in American history, including the eventual use of atomic weapons against Japan, decisions that remain the subject of intense historical debate even today. He left office in 1953 as a relatively unpopular president, but his reputation experienced a significant revival in later decades, as historians increasingly credited him with steady leadership during an extraordinarily difficult transitional period for the country. When Truman died in 1972, he was buried not in a distant cemetery or a family plot, but directly within the courtyard of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri, an institution he had personally helped establish and remained deeply involved with throughout his post-presidential years. Some historians suggest this choice reflected Truman's plain-spoken, unpretentious personality, a preference for practical, grounded arrangements over elaborate memorials, consistent with his reputation as a president who prided himself on being an ordinary man from Missouri rather than a distant, larger-than-life figure. Others argue the courtyard burial represented a deliberate effort to permanently tie his legacy to the institution responsible for preserving and interpreting it, ensuring that visitors studying his presidency would also quite literally stand steps away from his actual grave. His wife, Bess Truman, who had been his partner since childhood in Independence, was buried beside him a decade later in 1982, reuniting the couple within the same courtyard they had once walked through during the library's dedication ceremonies years earlier. Today, visitors touring the library often describe the experience as unusually personal, moving directly from exhibits chronicling atomic diplomacy, the Korean War, and the early Cold War straight into a quiet courtyard containing the simple graves of the president and his wife, a juxtaposition that feels distinctly different from the grand marble memorials associated with some of his predecessors. It's a fitting final arrangement for a man whose legacy continues to be reassessed and debated, some crediting him with laying the foundation for America's post-war global leadership, others raising lasting questions about the human cost of decisions made under his watch, but whose chosen resting place left no doubt about how directly he wanted his life and his historical legacy permanently connected. And speaking of presidents who chose deeply personal, almost humble settings over grand national memorials, let's travel to Abilene, Kansas, where Dwight Eisenhower arranged for his own burial in a small chapel far removed from the marble grandeur many might have expected for a five-star general and two-term president. Number 37, Dwight Eisenhower's Kansas Chapel Crypt. Eisenhower had spent decades commanding armies, shaping global military strategy, and eventually leading the nation through the early years of the Cold War, a career trajectory that placed him among the most internationally recognized figures of the 20th century by the time he left the White House in 1961. Given his stature, many assumed he would be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, joining the ranks of military heroes and fellow commanders resting beneath the rows of white headstones overlooking Washington. Instead, Eisenhower chose a small meditation chapel on the grounds of his presidential library in Abilene, Kansas, the modest town where he had grown up as one of 7 sons in a family of limited means, long before his name became synonymous with victory in Europe. Some historians suggest this decision reflected Eisenhower's genuine desire to be remembered first as a son of Kansas rather than as a 5-star general or a president, a nod to the humble Midwestern values he often credited with shaping his character. Others argue the choice was a calculated act of legacy management, ensuring his final resting place remained permanently tied to the library and museum built specifically to preserve his story for future generations, much like Truman's courtyard arrangement in Missouri. When Eisenhower died in 1969, his funeral combined full military honors with a strikingly simple burial, his flag-draped casket placed inside a chapel crypt, so unassuming that many visitors are surprised by just how small the space actually is. His wife, Mamie Eisenhower, was buried beside him in 1979, and their infant son, Dowd, who had died decades earlier in 1921, was later moved to rest alongside them, reuniting the family within the same quiet chapel walls. Today, the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum draws visitors who often note the contrast between the sweeping historical narrative told inside the exhibits, spanning D-Day planning rooms to Cold War decision-making, and the understated crypt just steps away, containing nothing more elaborate than simple marble markers. It remains one of the more modest final resting places among 20th century presidents, a fitting bookend for a man whose public image was built on plainspoken competence rather than personal grandeur. And speaking of presidential funerals that introduced entirely new traditions to Arlington National Cemetery, let's shift to a grave that would forever change how Americans visualize presidential remembrance. Number 38, John F. Kennedy's Eternal Flame. When Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, the nation experienced a level of collective shock rarely seen before in American history, and the funeral that followed became one of the most closely watched public events of the century, broadcast live to millions of households across the country and around the world. Kennedy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, a decision that itself broke from convention, since presidents had traditionally been buried in their home states or on family properties rather than in the National Military Cemetery. During the funeral planning, Jacqueline Kennedy specifically requested that an eternal flame be installed at her husband's gravesite, reportedly inspired by the eternal flame she had seen burning at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris during an earlier visit to France. Some historians suggest this request reflected her desire to create a permanent, visible symbol of continuity and remembrance, something that would keep her husband's memory burning long after the initial shock of his death had faded from public consciousness. Others argue the eternal flame became something larger than a personal tribute, quickly transforming into a national symbol of unity during an extraordinarily turbulent period in American history. The flame was lit during the funeral ceremony itself, and Jacqueline Kennedy used a special torch to ignite it before it was transferred to a permanent apparatus designed to keep it burning continuously, fed by a constant gas line specifically engineered for that purpose. In the years since, the flame has required occasional maintenance and even brief relighting after mechanical failures, but it has remained a defining feature of the gravesite, drawing millions of visitors annually who come to see the flickering flame set against the backdrop of Arlington's rolling hills. It remains the only presidential grave at Arlington marked by an eternal flame, a permanent fixture that transformed Kennedy's burial site into one of the most visited and instantly recognizable presidential memorials in the country. And speaking of funeral traditions that carry deep symbolic weight beyond just the gravesite itself, let's look at one particular detail from Kennedy's funeral procession that struck many observers as hauntingly appropriate. Number 39, Kennedy's horse without a rider. As Kennedy's flag-draped casket made its way through the streets of Washington atop a horse-drawn caisson, it was followed by a riderless black horse named Black Jack, a detail that added an unmistakable layer of solemnity to an already emotionally overwhelming procession. Black Jack was a well-known ceremonial horse belonging to the Army's Old Guard, and he had already participated in other military funerals before Kennedy's, but his appearance that day became one of the most enduring images associated with the assassination's aftermath. The riderless horse tradition dates back centuries, symbolizing a fallen leader who would ride no more, and it had previously been used during the funerals of other American military figures, though its appearance during Kennedy's funeral cemented it firmly in the public imagination. Adding to the symbolism, Black Jack's saddle carried a pair of boots placed backward in the stirrups, a traditional gesture representing a fallen commander looking back one final time upon his troops. Some historians suggest this detail resonated so powerfully specifically because Kennedy had served in the military himself during World War II, making the symbolism feel particularly fitting rather than purely ceremonial. Others argue the riderless horse became an unintentional visual metaphor for the nation's own emotional state at the time. A country left suddenly without its leader, uncertain and unsettled in the days following the assassination. Black Jack reportedly proved difficult to control that day, prancing and resisting throughout the procession, which some observers at the time interpreted as the horse sensing the somber occasion, though handlers later explained the behavior as fairly typical for the spirited animal. The image of Black Jack walking alongside Kennedy's caisson has since become one of the most reproduced photographs from the entire funeral, appearing in countless documentaries, history books, and retrospectives marking the anniversary of Kennedy's death. It remains a striking example of how deeply symbolic military funeral traditions can shape the way a nation processes grief on a massive public scale. And speaking of presidents who chose the land they knew best over the marble institutions of Washington, let's head to the Texas Hill Country, where a rancher who happened to become president made sure his final resting place stayed exactly where his story began. Number 40, Lyndon Johnson's ranch burial. When Johnson died in January 1973, just days before Nixon's second inauguration, the nation was still deeply divided over the legacy of the Vietnam War, a conflict that had escalated dramatically under his administration and ultimately drove him to announce he would not seek re-election in 1968. Despite the political weight and controversy attached to his presidency, Johnson's funeral arrangements reflected a desire to return, quite literally, to his roots. His body first lay in state at the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, where thousands filed past to pay respects, followed by a formal funeral service held with full military honors, complete with a flag-draped casket and the ceremonial pageantry typically reserved for heads of state. From there, his body was flown back to Texas, where a second, more intimate service took place at Stonewall, the small community near his beloved LBJ Ranch along the Pedernales River. Some historians suggest Johnson specifically requested burial on his own property because he wanted his legacy tied permanently to the land that shaped him, a place he often used to entertain foreign dignitaries and journalists throughout his presidency, informally dubbed the Texas White House. Others argue it reflected a broader pattern among presidents seeking to control their own historical narrative, choosing personal, familiar ground over the more anonymous, institutional resting places available in Washington. Johnson was buried in the family cemetery on the ranch grounds, surrounded by relatives under the shade of oak trees he had walked beneath since childhood, a stark contrast to the formality of the Capitol ceremony just days earlier. Lady Bird Johnson was later buried beside him in 2007, and the site remains part of the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park, allowing visitors to walk the same grounds where Johnson once famously showed off his ranch to reporters while driving them around in his convertible. It remains one of the more personal presidential burial sites in American history, a rancher's return to his own soil after a presidency defined by both sweeping domestic reform and devastating foreign war. And speaking of funerals that became unexpected gatherings of political history, let's turn to a ceremony in California that brought together an unusual assembly of men who had all once held the nation's highest office. Number 41, Richard Nixon's library funeral. When Nixon died in April 1994, his funeral became something few could have predicted decades earlier, during the depths of the Watergate scandal that had forced his resignation in 1974, the only resignation of a sitting president in American history. Rather than a state funeral in Washington, Nixon's family arranged for the service to take place at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California, near the modest house where he had been born, a detail that echoed Johnson's return to Texas roots just years earlier. What made the funeral especially notable was the presence of 5 living presidents gathered together on the same stage: Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter, an assembly that some historians suggest represented one of the more remarkable bipartisan moments of the decade, given how contentious Nixon's legacy remained even 20 years after his resignation. Clinton, the sitting president at the time, delivered a eulogy urging the nation to judge Nixon's entire career rather than focus solely on Watergate, a sentiment that drew mixed reactions from commentators who argued the scandal deserved continued scrutiny rather than historical softening. Others suggest the gathering reflected an unspoken tradition among former presidents, a fraternity bound by shared experience of the office regardless of political rivalry or personal history. Reagan, already showing early signs of the Alzheimer's disease that would eventually claim his own life, delivered what became one of his final major public speeches. Nixon was buried beside his wife, Pat Nixon, who had died the previous year on the library grounds itself, ensuring his final resting place remained permanently tied to the institution built to preserve and reframe his legacy for future generations. And speaking of presidential farewells that stretched across multiple cities before finally settling into permanent rest, let's look at a funeral that quietly honored a presidency largely defined by healing rather than headlines. Number 42. Gerald Ford's 3-city farewell. When Ford died in December 2006, his funeral observances unfolded across an unusually long, multi-city itinerary, beginning in Palm Springs, California, where he had spent much of his retirement before moving to Washington for a formal state funeral at the Capitol and National Cathedral. Some historians suggest the extended, cross-country send-off reflected Ford's unique position in presidential history, a man who had never been elected president or vice president through a national ballot, yet still received the full ceremonial honors reserved for elected leaders, a reminder of his unusual path to the office following Nixon's resignation and Spiro Agnew's earlier exit. Others argue the lengthy itinerary simply reflected modern logistical norms for presidential funerals, allowing mourners across multiple regions the opportunity to pay respects. After the Washington ceremonies concluded, Ford's body was flown to Grand Rapids, Michigan, the city where he had built his early political career, representing the state in Congress for decades before ascending to the vice presidency and eventually the presidency itself. There, he was buried on the grounds of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, joining a growing tradition among modern presidents of choosing permanent rest at the very institutions built to preserve their legacies. Betty Ford was later buried beside him in 2011, ensuring the couple remained together at the site overlooking the Grand River. It remains a fitting final chapter for a president whose brief, unelected term was largely remembered for restoring a sense of stability to a nation still reeling from Watergate. And speaking of presidents who found peace watching the sun disappear into the very ocean that shaped so much of American history, let's head back to Washington one more time before making our way west to California. Number 43. Ronald Reagan's nighttime Capitol vigil. When Reagan died in June 2004, after spending the final decade of his life largely out of public view due to Alzheimer's disease, the nation seemed to rediscover its affection for him almost overnight, and the funeral arrangements reflected that outpouring in ways few had anticipated. His body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, where mourners lined up for hours, stretching for blocks through the streets of Washington, some waiting through the entire night just for a few seconds beside the flag-draped casket. Some historians suggest the sheer scale of that overnight vigil surprised even the planners, who had built contingency plans around Reagan's own detailed wishes for his funeral, wishes he had reportedly helped shape years earlier alongside aides who understood how carefully he cared about his public image and historical legacy. Others argue the vigil reflected a broader national mood at the time, a country eager to remember an era before the polarization that followed. a moment when a former president's death briefly united people across political lines who otherwise disagreed about nearly everything else. The Capitol stayed open around the clock to accommodate the crowds, an accommodation rarely extended for previous presidential lyings in state, and Rotunda staff later described it as one of the largest overnight turnouts they had ever witnessed. Military honor guards stood watch in rotating shifts, maintaining the same solemn ceremony hour after hour as the line of mourners continued well past midnight and into the early morning hours before the formal funeral service began. It was by most accounts one of the more emotionally striking overnight vigils in modern presidential history, a quiet nighttime tribute before the far more famous sunset burial that would follow just days later on the opposite coast. And speaking of that sunset burial itself, let's finish Reagan's story by traveling to the coastline he loved so much during his years away from Washington. Number 44, Reagan's sunset burial. After the Washington ceremonies concluded, Reagan's body was flown to California, where his funeral concluded with a burial specifically timed to coincide with sunset overlooking the Pacific Ocean at the Presidential Library built in his name in Simi Valley. Some historians suggest the timing was deliberately chosen years in advance by Reagan himself, who had reportedly selected the hillside burial site specifically because of its unobstructed view toward the ocean, a detail that seemed to reflect his lifelong fondness for California landscapes going back to his years as governor, and before that his career in Hollywood. Others argue the sunset symbolism was simply an elegant coincidence embraced by funeral planners eager to give the ceremony a sense of poetic closure, marking the end of what many described as the final act of the 20th century's presidential story. Nancy Reagan, who had overseen much of the planning alongside her husband in the years before his death, sat beside the casket as the sun dropped toward the horizon, and witnesses later described the moment as strikingly cinematic, almost as if it had been staged for one final photograph befitting a former actor turned president. The service itself included tributes from world leaders, former staff and family members, but it was the visual of the burial site itself, framed by rolling hills and the distant ocean, that became the most enduring image from the entire funeral. Reagan was laid to rest as darkness settled in, and Nancy Reagan was later buried beside him in 2016, ensuring the two remained together at the site they had personally chosen together long before his death. It remains one of the most visually memorable presidential burials in American history, a fitting farewell for a man whose presidency was defined, at least in part, by his mastery of imagery and symbolism. And speaking of presidents who took one final journey by rail rather than by air, let's shift from the Pacific coastline back to Texas, where a different kind of farewell unfolded on train tracks that hadn't carried a presidential funeral in decades. Number 45, George H.W. Bush's Union Pacific train ride. When Bush died in November 2018, his funeral arrangements included a detail that hadn't been seen in a presidential farewell since Eisenhower's funeral back in 1969. A slow, deliberate journey by train, rather than the far more common motorcade or aircraft transport used in nearly every modern presidential funeral since. After formal services in Washington, Bush's casket traveled aboard a specially prepared Union Pacific train from Houston to College Station, Texas, where he would be buried on the grounds of his own presidential library at Texas A&M University. Some historians suggest the train was chosen specifically because of Bush's personal fondness for trains, a detail reportedly requested well in advance, and the train itself, painted in a distinctive blue and marked simply 4141 after Bush's own presidential library designation, became something of a spectacle in its own right, as it rolled slowly through small Texas towns along the route. Others argue the choice reflected a broader desire among the Bush family to give the public a rare, visible opportunity to witness the funeral procession firsthand, allowing communities along the tracks to gather trackside, wave flags, and pay their respects in a way that simply was impossible with air travel. Thousands of people lined the route, some standing for hours in open fields, just to catch a brief glimpse of the train as it passed, a scene reminiscent of the historic funeral train that carried Abraham Lincoln's body across the country more than a century earlier. Local schools let students out early, fire departments held ceremonial salutes at crossings, and small towns that rarely saw national attention suddenly found themselves part of a moment in presidential history. When the train finally arrived in College Station, Bush was laid to rest beside his wife, Barbara, and their daughter Robin, who had died in childhood decades earlier, completing a family reunion that had been decades in the making. It remains one of the more visually memorable and widely witnessed presidential funeral processions of the modern era, a slow, symbolic farewell that gave ordinary Americans a rare front row seat to history. And speaking of Bush's funeral continuing to reveal small, unexpectedly emotional details even after the train had reached its final stop, let's talk about one image from that same funeral that ended up touching more people than almost anything else in the entire ceremony. Number 46. Bush's service dog at the funeral. In the days leading up to George H.W. Bush's funeral, a single photograph spread across social media faster than almost any other image connected to his death. A photograph of his yellow Labrador service dog, Sully, lying quietly beside his flag-draped casket. Sully had only been paired with Bush a few months earlier, trained specifically to assist him after decades of declining mobility linked to a form of Parkinsonism, and the dog had reportedly become a steady, comforting presence during Bush's final months. Some historians suggest the image resonated so strongly because it captured something rarely seen in presidential funerals, a moment of quiet, almost private grief amid an otherwise highly choreographed national ceremony full of dignitaries, motorcades, and formal military honors. Others argue the photograph's popularity said less about Bush himself and more about how the public related to the idea of loyalty, a service animal remaining faithfully at his side, even in death, a detail that felt universally understandable regardless of political affiliation. The Bush family later confirmed that Sully would go on to work with wounded military veterans through America's Vet Dogs, the same organization that trained him, giving the story an additional layer of meaning beyond the funeral itself. Photographers noted that Sully lay unusually still throughout the ceremony, prompting some observers to describe the moment as almost eerily composed, as if the dog understood the solemnity of the occasion, though trainers cautioned that the behavior simply reflected months of disciplined service training rather than any deeper canine awareness of death. Still, the image became one of the most widely shared visuals from the entire funeral, surpassing even some of the formal ceremonial photographs taken inside the Capitol Rotunda. It offered a brief human moment of stillness inside a funeral, otherwise dominated by pageantry, motorcades, and international dignitaries, and it remains one of the more quietly memorable details from Bush's farewell, a small reminder that even amid the grandest state funerals, the simplest images often leave the deepest impression. And speaking of presidents who spent years quietly shaping their own funeral plans long before their deaths, let's turn to a former president who spoke about his own mortality with a level of openness rarely seen from anyone who once held the nation's highest office. Number 47. Jimmy Carter's planned plains burial. Jimmy Carter, who lived longer than any president in American history, spent his final years remarkably candid about his own mortality, discussing his eventual funeral plans publicly in interviews long before his death, a level of transparency that stood in sharp contrast to the more secretive planning process typically associated with presidential funerals. Carter's stated plans, shared through both family statements and public interviews, describe a funeral centered not in Washington but in Plains, Georgia, the small town where he was born, where he taught Sunday school for decades, and where he and Rosalind Carter built the modest home they lived in long after leaving the White House. Some historians suggest this reflects Carter's lifelong rejection of presidential grandeur, a man who reportedly preferred sleeping in his own bed in Plains over grander accommodations even during his presidency, and who seemed determined to carry that same simplicity into his final arrangements. Others argue the choice carries deeper symbolic weight, a deliberate statement that his legacy was rooted not in the power of the presidency itself, but in the small-town values and quiet service that defined his life both before and after his time in office. According to publicly reported plans, Carter intended to be buried beside Rosalind Carter, who passed away in November 2023, in a spot near their Plains home, a resting place chosen specifically for its connection to the life they built together long before either of them ever imagined reaching the White House. Some reports suggest a willow tree near the home holds particular significance in these plans, though details have varied slightly across different accounts over the years. Whatever the precise arrangements ultimately are, Carter's openness about his own funeral planning stands as a rare example of a former president discussing death not as a distant abstraction but as a practical, deeply personal matter. One final act of transparency from a man whose post-presidency was defined by decades of humanitarian work and remarkable candor. And speaking of ceremonial traditions that connect every modern presidential funeral back to centuries of military custom, Let's finish with one detail present in nearly every state funeral, whether the public consciously notices it or not. Number 48. Presidential state funeral gun salutes. Every modern presidential state funeral includes a formal military tradition that dates back centuries. A ceremonial gun salute performed according to strict protocol established long before any currently living American was born. Traditionally, deceased presidents receive a 21-gun salute, the highest honor within American military ceremonial tradition, fired not from small arms but from artillery pieces positioned specifically for the occasion, producing a slow, deliberate rhythm rather than a rapid volley. Some historians suggest the number 21 traces back to naval customs from the age of sailing ships, when firing all of a ship's guns signaled that the vessel carried no remaining ammunition and therefore posed no threat, a gesture of respect adapted over time into modern military ceremony. Others argue the tradition's exact origins remain somewhat uncertain, with multiple competing theories about how the specific number 21 became standardized across different branches of the military and different nations following similar customs. Regardless of its precise origin, the salute has become a fixed expected element of presidential funerals, performed at key moments such as the arrival of the casket or its final placement at the burial site, timed precisely alongside other formal elements like the playing of Hail to the Chief and the folding of the American flag. Military historians note that these salutes require extensive coordination, with honor guards rehearsing timing down to the second to ensure the ceremonial cannon fire aligns perfectly with other elements of the service. For most Americans, the sound of the gun salute is one of the most immediately recognizable audio cues associated with a presidential funeral, even if few could explain its historical origins if asked directly. It remains one of the final formal honors bestowed upon a president, a tradition connecting modern ceremonies to centuries of military custom, and a fitting, thunderous close to 50 facts surrounding the surprisingly complex, symbolic, and occasionally deeply personal world of presidential funerals in America. And speaking of ceremonial honors that many Americans assume are automatic but actually depend on a complex set of historical precedents, let's look at one of the most visually striking traditions in American mourning, one that isn't guaranteed to every president who dies. Number 49, the Capitol Rotunda's Select Honor. Lying in state beneath the Capitol Rotunda is often treated by the public as a standard, expected part of every presidential funeral, largely because television coverage of the practice has made it one of the most recognizable images associated with a president's death. In reality, this honor is far from automatic and has historically been reserved for a relatively small number of presidents, selected through a combination of congressional resolution, family wishes, and long-standing custom rather than any fixed constitutional requirement. The tradition dates back to Abraham Lincoln in 1865, whose casket rested in the rotunda as thousands of mourners filed past in a scene that some historians describe as the origin point for the entire modern concept of national presidential mourning. Since then, only a select group of presidents have received the same honor, including figures like Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, and George H.W. Bush, while others were buried through private or regional ceremonies without ever passing through the Capitol at all. Some historians suggest the decision often reflects a mixture of political timing, public sentiment, and the personal preferences of the president or their family, meaning two presidents with similarly significant legacies could receive very different treatment simply based on circumstances surrounding their death. Others argue the honor has increasingly become tied to how a president's public image is remembered in the years immediately following their passing, with popular or unifying figures more likely to be granted the rotunda ceremony than those whose legacies remain more contested at the time of their death. The logistics themselves are notably intricate, requiring coordination between the family, Congress, the military, and the architect of the Capitol, who oversees the physical arrangement of the flag-draped casket atop the Lincoln catafalque, a wooden bier constructed specifically for Lincoln's funeral and reused for every lying-in-state ceremony since. Some reports note that the catafalque has become such an object of historical fascination that it now sits on permanent display, a quiet physical link between every president who has received this rare distinction. Members of the public who assume that lying in state is guaranteed to any former president may be surprised to learn how selective the practice actually is, and how many presidents throughout history were instead buried through smaller, more private ceremonies far removed from the marble columns and echoing silence of the rotunda. It remains one of the clearest examples of how presidential funerals, despite their shared formal structure, can vary dramatically in scale and symbolism depending on the era, the individual, and the political climate surrounding their death. And speaking of grand ceremonial locations that don't necessarily determine where a president's story finally comes to rest, let's look at a cathedral that has hosted more presidential farewells than almost any other building in the country, despite rarely being anyone's final resting place. Number 50, the National Cathedral's Presidential Services. Washington National Cathedral, an enormous Gothic structure perched on one of the highest points in the Capitol, has become one of the most frequently used sites for presidential funeral services in modern history, even though none of the presidents honored there are actually buried within its walls. Some historians suggest the cathedral's rise as a favored funeral site reflects its unique position as a non-denominational space capable of accommodating massive crowds, foreign dignitaries, and elaborate television broadcasts, all while maintaining a solemn, historically resonant atmosphere befitting a head of state. Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, and George H.W. Bush all received formal funeral services within the cathedral's soaring nave, ceremonies attended by sitting presidents, foreign leaders, and thousands of invited guests, even though each of these men was ultimately buried in a different location entirely, ranging from presidential libraries to family plots in their home states. Some reports suggest this separation between service and burial site reflects a broader shift in how modern presidential funerals are structured, with the public ceremonial elements increasingly centralized in Washington, while the more private, personal element of burial takes place wherever the individual president felt most connected, whether that's a boyhood hometown, a presidential library campus, or a quiet family cemetery far from the Capitol's spotlight. Others argue the cathedral's repeated use has as much to do with practical logistics as symbolism, since few buildings in Washington can comfortably host the scale of security, seating, and broadcast equipment required for a state funeral of this magnitude. The building itself contains a small presidential connection beyond its funeral history, as Woodrow Wilson is actually entombed within the cathedral, making him the only president buried within Washington, D.C. itself, a fact that occasionally causes confusion among visitors who assume other presidents honored there shared the same fate. Some historians note that the cathedral's Gothic architecture, complete with towering stained glass windows and intricate stonework, lends these ceremonies a visual grandeur that TV audiences have come to associate almost automatically with presidential mourning, even though the tradition of using this specific building is a relatively modern development, compared to the centuries-old customs surrounding burial and lying in state. Whatever the precise mixture of symbolism, logistics, and personal preference behind each decision, the National Cathedral remains a recurring backdrop in the modern presidential funeral story, a place where the nation gathers to say goodbye, even when the president being honored will ultimately rest somewhere else entirely, closing out this journey through 50 facts with one final reminder that in the world of presidential funerals, where a nation mourns and where a leader is finally laid to rest are very often two entirely different places.